Hello, 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 Kansas City, and all of my Facebook audience. Once again, this is Twoana Clark Shepherd back for another edition of Talk About It with Twoana, where we discuss the myths and misconceptions surrounding mental health, and we do our best to get you and your loved ones connected to the resources needed to live a more abundant life. So, today's guest is Miss Lynn Barnett, and she is an author. So I am going to start out with reading her bio. I'm trying to do better at that for my guests, as you all have heard me say, so I finally made it to that point. And so our topic today is attachment disorder in children. So that's what we're going to be focusing on. And as always, let me remind my Facebook audience, those of you who are watching us live on Facebook, please make your comments, have questions ready. Please use the comment section if you have questions. And about halfway through, I try to take a look and see if there's anything that needs to be answered right away. And then also, remember, I'll tell you at the beginning of the show and at the end, you always can leave comments in my messenger if what you need to say or a question you have or the area you want to talk about is a little more personal than what we can do on live, okay? So without further ado, I'm going to get started by reading my guest Lynn's bio. So first of all, this is her book. It's called Raising Wild Cats. So hopefully you all can see that. It's called Raising Wild Cats, Parenting Children with Attachment Disorder, and I want to welcome you. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being willing to share your knowledge. As I tell all my guests all the time, feel free to look at me, feel free to look at camera, whatever you want to do. We're just going to have a conversation about this issue, okay? So, Lynn Barnett was born and raised in Kansas City. She has an extensive background working with young children. She earned a master's degree in psychology and social work from the University of Missouri. In 1997, Lynn traveled to China to adopt a 17-month-old with a strong personality and moderately severe reactive attachment challenges. Then in 2001, she traveled to Phnom Penh, thank you for helping me with that because I knew I was going to butcher it, Cambodia, to adopt a 33-month-old with milder attachment challenges. After working for several years training foster families and working with children in the foster care system, Lynn created Mid-America Family Treatment Center and started her private practice as an attachment-focused family therapist. As her business grew, Lynn found that a growing number of families reached out to her for answers to their hardest questions about attachment disorders, fetal alcohol issues, and sensory integration dysfunction. Wow. So I am super excited to have this conversation today. As always, I start with some myths that I've discovered either through practice or doing some research or a combination of both. Okay. So we're going to just talk through those myths, and please feel free to share your knowledge, your experiences as well are really helpful, and then we'll talk a little bit about raising wildcats before we finish up, okay?
Okay.
Right. So, myth number 1. Problems with attachment rarely happen or aren't real. So, popular literature tends to state that reactive attachment disorder is relatively uncommon. Now, that's what literature tends to state as I was doing my research. But as a practitioner, I don't find that to be true. And I'm probably jumping ahead in our discussion because then I'm about to say why I think that is. But I think that a lot of that is because the research, the effort and the resources put into researching this is so limited. And I found that to be true when I was kind of doing research. Does that make sense?
Right.
Right? So, relatively uncommon.
Well, okay. So let's start out with attachment is a continuum.
Okay.
Okay. On this end of the continuum, you have a child who was born to mom and had mommy and daddy, and who was taken care of and nurtured and loved and cared for, and every need this child had, mom and dad were right there.
Right.
That's okay. So the child learned really important skills like cause and effect thinking, and because you get cause and effect when you cry and the baby cries and mom comes running,
That's
or
right. That's the
or
effect.
baby says ooh and daddy says ah, and all those things happen in that first year and a half, 2 years of the child reacts and the parent acts back.
Right.
Okay, so you've got that child over here. And over here, you've got the child who grew up in a Romanian orphanage, or a Russian orphanage, or a Chinese orphanage, or a child who grew up in the United States with a drug-addicted parent, and the child cried, and sometimes they came, and sometimes they didn't, and sometimes they smacked the kid, and sometimes they didn't, and sometimes they fed the child, and sometimes they didn't. And then you have a child who no longer trusts. They don't get cause and effect because they cry and nothing happens, right?
Right.
So they also don't get social skills because one of the things that happens with an attached baby is the social skills that happen in the interaction, right?
Correct.
The social skills that don't happen over here.
Okay.
With the child who sometimes gets it and sometimes doesn't, and most often doesn't, and sometimes the only kind of stimulation they get is banging their head against a wall. And okay, so then you have Jeffrey Dahmer. Okay, or you might not have Jeffrey Dahmer. You might have a child who doesn't attach. They don't trust adults. They don't. They feel like they have to be in control all the time, because if they're not, they're going to die.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So
kind of got to fend for themselves. They've had to figure it out on their own.
They've had to figure it out on their own.
With a very low level, base level of skill set, because kids aren't born naturally with those skill sets.
And you've got a kid with a broken cause and effect button.
Exactly.
And that's the kid I see.
Okay.
And so for your research your research is saying it doesn't occur very often, and that level of well, it doesn't happen very often is interesting to me, because I see it all the time. I see kids coming in from foster care who have to control every single moment of the day, or they don't trust their foster parents to make any decisions for them, or they can't. The foster parent says it's time to go wash our hands, and the kid is going, Okay, so I see kids like this all the time.
And so what occurred to me then when I was doing this, compiling this research, and you've basically then confirmed it, there's so many other things that both of us see as practitioners, but a lot of our public experiences that they don't know is RAD, or reactive attachment disorder, because it mimics other things, right?
Exactly. And the problem is that what a lot of people do is they think it's their fault. The child, and I'll discuss this later, and so keep it in our mind.
Okay.
A term called the nurturing enemy, and the nurturing enemy is the parent figure who the child is angry at because it wasn't safe to be angry at their parent. It wasn't safe to be angry at the abusive parent. Okay, so then that the nurturing enemy feels responsible.
So some people would call that deflecting, or the recipient of some deflecting.
Some deflecting,
Yes.
some projecting. Okay, so now you have a child who it may not be over here,
Right.
certainly not over here,
Right.
but maybe falls somewhere in the middle.
Right.
Sometimes the child is capable of attaching in some ways, and sometimes the child's not. And so you've got, and I think that the idea that every single kid we have in our society is a Jeffrey Dahmer is wrong.
Right.
But then the child who looks like this and the relationship like that doesn't happen either.
Right.
Because this is a perfectly attached child.
Right. Right. So what we're saying here is that oftentimes there's misdiagnoses. Oftentimes there's no assessment ever done because you've got that other parent that is just spinning and spinning and spinning their wheels to exhaustion, just trying to figure it out on their own, trying to maybe make up for something that they may have a suspicion that
But they're clueless about
why that is.
When Isaac, my oldest child, was about 2.5, we took him in to see a therapist.
Okay.
And now in those days they didn't talk about attachment. They didn't talk about attachment disorder. They still don't. But they didn't talk. They don't talk about attachment disorder, and they certainly weren't going to talk about that with the 2.5-year-old child.
Right.
So we're trying to figure out what's going on, why this child has to control every single facet of his life, and what's happening. And the therapist takes the child from me, takes the child into another room, plays with the child for half an hour, brings the child back and says, "It's your fault. You did it."
Yeah.
And I said, "In what way did I do it?" Now, okay, I'm a therapist, right?
Yeah.
And I'm going, "In what way did I do it?" Well, you're spoiling.
Oh.
And I said, "In what way am I spoiling him?" Well,
Okay, that's interesting. So you did too much.
And I wasn't
something.
alone. I'm not a single parent. Now,
Right.
in this book, it talks about me as a single, kind of shows me as, I'm not a single parent.
Right.
I never was.
Right.
And my spouse and I, we didn't spoil this child.
Right.
And we just kind of looked at each other. Eventually, we got an attachment therapist. And the attachment therapist never saw my child alone. Never took the child away. Never brought the child back. It's one thing I don't do. I don't ever take the child away from the parent into my office and bring the child back and say, "Okay, I fixed him."
Because before we started recording, we were having a little bit of a chit chat about something really related to that in how certain individuals practice and how much progress can you really make with a child, separating that child from the caregivers all of the time or a majority of the time. It just, it just doesn't really, in our humble opinion, it doesn't really work.
I never take a child from a parent. I don't want that. I don't want the children I work with to attach to me.
Correct.
I want the child that I work with to attach to the parent that they're working with. And that may be a foster parent, and the foster parent is saying to me, "Well, why would you want that to happen?" If the child attaches to a foster parent, they can attach to another person.
It's like practice.
It's exactly. It's like rehearsal.
You teach them how, and then you practice it, and you practice
keep doing
it, and keep doing it.
And so I don't ever see a child alone.
Okay.
For two reasons. One is I don't want them to attach to me. I want them to attach to the parent.
Correct.
Second reason is children with attachment disorders lie. And I don't want that child telling me that the foster parent hit them or hurt them or whatever, and then I have to do a report, and I don't want to do that.
Correct.
So, or they might do it with me. They might say, "Well, she hit me," or it's a protection thing. But the biggest reason is that they need to attach to
The caregiver.
the person taking care of them.
That's right.
So I just don't.
Thank you for that. That's good clarity. So number 2, attachment and trauma issues only happen, and I did not even know your history before I picked this as number 2, so just wait to hear it, just so y'all know. I didn't really know our history. And so, attachment and trauma issues only happen to adoptees, and mostly international ones. Only happens to adoptees, and mostly international.
Actually,
so you can speak, I think, across the whole spectrum of this.
okay. Well, one of the things we know is the children who are coming from Russia, Ukraine, China. Isaac came from one of the orphanages known as the Dying Rooms, which was a documentary several years ago. But there are other children who come from drug addicted, alcohol addicted families who are just as reactive attachment disorder. There are children who spend months, their first several months, in an incubator, away from their biological mother or their family, or a child who might be, have been given up and, given up by the biological parent, and we're in an incubator or in a NICU or in a hospital or a child who was sick, a child with chronic physical issues, who spends the better part of their young life in a hospital. And those children suffer just as much with reactive attachment issues as the child who doesn't have anybody to take care of them in a Russian orphanage or a Ukrainian orphanage. And by the way, it's interesting, I've met several children who come from Ukrainian orphanages who are very well attached.
Fine.
Or Russian orphanages who are very attached. Children, a lot of reactive attachment disorder and some of those mental illness issues really do happen. It's interesting that some children are more resilient.
Right.
Some children just are born with a resiliency and an ability to connect with their caregiver. I worked really, really hard with Isaac, and I was up at 3 o'clock in the morning several nights, a lot, throughout his very, very young life, and holding him and snuggling him and playing with him and watching Barney and drinking juice and eating cookies at 3 o'clock in the morning and singing Barney songs and.
No, Isaac is your oldest.
He's my oldest.
Your oldest, okay.
And he's my oldest. And we connected at 3 o'clock in the morning. And I just made sure that child connected. And I did that through music for me. That worked for me. But he was one of the resilient ones. He's going okay.
He's doing okay.
He's doing okay.
So, a little more about that particular one. The fact is that trauma and attachment difficulties can happen to any children who are traumatized, whether by abuse, neglect, medical pain, that is not mitigated, in utero stress, or breaks from their primary caregiver, which is what you said, all of that. Things can happen anywhere to any child in any economic and social situation. I felt that was worthy to point out. Adoption in of itself also, just to be clear, does not cause that level of trauma, although the way in which an adoption or foster care move often happens where there can be little regard for the child's emotional well-being can be traumatizing and a contributing factor as well. And then something else that I found to be true, but I wrote it down, but you already said it, is there is no such thing as a good orphanage. I thought that was worth pointing out, right?
Well, right.
Because that means there's a good orphanage, there's a bad orphanage. It's like anything else we talk about in mental health. You've got a spectrum.
Right.
And so...
You can have everything from the best orphanage in the world to the worst orphanage in the world.
Exactly.
Right.
So,
Well,
Go ahead.
and I want to say
Jump
this
in, jump
because
in.
I think it's really important. And you're right. Children from any socioeconomic, strata. Keep in mind that adoption is one of those things, though, that a child has to lose something in order to gain something. So while adoption is a gift, it's also a loss.
Right.
And even a child who is 3 days old has developed a relationship with the person who carried them for 9 months.
That's right. That's
So
correct.
and they hear and they feel and they know
That's correct.
and then to be separated from that person, that's a loss.
And that's good point. That's good to point out, because I think a lot of people don't consider the true science, I would say, behind that fact. That children spend at 9 to 10 months, technically, attaching to the mother that's carrying them. They hear. We know that, I think, but a lot of people don't know that's kind of well known now, that a child can hear in utero. They hear, they feel, they get used to a certain pattern of that mother's heartbeat. And so it is important to point out that there is an impact.
So if there's violence, if there's abuse, if there's drug abuse, if there's stress, if there's financial stress, if there's emotional stress, any of those things are going to impact the child.
That's right.
And it's going to change the child's biology. It's going to change the child's brain. And when we think of trauma, we don't realize what we're thinking about is trauma to the brain.
Right.
So a child who is carried in an environment where there's abuse is going to have a higher level of cortisol.
Yes.
And they're going to have a higher level of adrenaline. And their serotonin's going to be lower. And so you've got a child who may not have ever actually lived with the biological parent, but they have higher cortisol. They're going to be.
You see an impact.
You
still
do.
see an impact, and people
immediately,
are so thrown by
you might
that.
have
Yeah.
a child who is startled easily.
Yes.
And I think one of the things I had a foster parent at one time, because I trained foster parents for KVC at one point.
Okay.
And I had a foster parent who said to me, "Why does this child startle? I don't think I see anywhere in the history that they were drug exposed." You don't have to be drug exposed. You can be, exposed to physical violence and still have a higher level of cortisol. And children who have higher levels of cortisol really do startle much quicker. It's more severe. It's they have a harder time settling down. They're more anxious.
And always try to break down, like, if we're using kind of scientific or clinical language. So you're talking about the cortisol and adrenaline, and as opposed to oxytocin,
which is a hormone.
You've got our calmers and you've got our uppers.
Right.
If we think about an upper, so if you have too much of those two things going on during the pregnancy, that child's going to have a propensity towards being excitable and anxious, right? Not enough serotonin. And so they're not going to have that natural connection to what we call self-soothing.
Right.
So
they will be harder to self-soothe.
they certainly will.
And then they also don't have the parent who's holding them through the difficulties and the difficult times. So yeah, they're going to have I think that in adults, I see a lot of adults who have borderline personality disorder, or they have, or they're anxious. They have a hard time self-calming. They're cutters, they have a hard time, with self-harming. Those folks really do struggle with a higher level of cortisol and a lower level of serotonin. They don't know how to self-soothe, and it's difficult for them, so they use self-harming or they use drugs, or they use alcohol, or they use relationships to fix those things that they didn't learn to do growing up.
And I'm glad you brought up yet another thing that came to me as I was researching the correlation between kind of what we're talking about first out in this segment, the correlation between drug addiction, alcohol addiction, and someone who was never properly diagnosed with reactive attachment disorder. Happens a lot.
I think a lot of the people we see in prison have reactive attachment issues. They may not have, they may not be the ones who, cut people up and eat them, like Jeffrey Dahmer did.
Exactly.
But they've got some level. I think
yes.
I think a lot of people who have borderline personality disorder, I think narcissistic personality disorder, it's that lack of a sense of self
yes.
that creates those disorders and
because those disorders often have a sense of disconnecting from yourself,
right,
and being able to do it at what for lack of a better word, on a almost expert level,
right. And exactly. And I think we see a lot of that in bipolar disorder as well.
Absolutely. Thank you. Okay, so myth number 3. He or she was too young to remember all of that. Well, we just kind of discussed the impact in utero, right? In pregnancy.
I just came back from a conference with Bessel van der Kolk.
Okay, tell us about who that is.
Bessel van der Kolk wrote a book called The Body Keeps the Score.
Okay.
And I think that he made a statement I thought was really interesting. Our bodies, our brains don't necessarily have to remember, but our bodies do.
Yes.
And I think
That's
our bodies,
so
our bodies remember things. When I used to work with borderline personality disorder, I worked with a lot of people who had a lot of physical issues or depression.
Okay.
Had a lot of physical issues. Their stomachs, were they had a lot of gastroenterological issues and migraines
and
lots of migraines.
Any medication.
Exactly, and lots of things that were ethereal that the doctors couldn't quite diagnose.
We call them psychosomatic.
And I think there's a reason we call that psychosomatic, and that is because it's the body keeps the score.
Right. The body keeps the score.
And I think that our brains keep the score. I think our brains remember those things. Remember the cortisol and the adrenaline and the lack of oxytocin and all those things kind of
we
interplay.
think because a person can't put verbiage to an actionable memory that they were too young. That's kind of where this comes from. If they can't put words to it, then it's not really relevant, when the reality is that it's very relevant, because you're studying a life. So you are any type of loved one or a caregiver or a physician of any type involved with people that we're talking about, right? You have the opportunity to study their life, and if you study their life versus being quick to jump to conclusions and throw solutions that don't work, which I'm getting ahead of myself, but I get real passionate and I start thinking about stuff like, if we would slow down and spend the time that it takes to actually look at what we're seeing for what it is, you're going to see a person that is very much so connected to something, and it's a consistent pattern. So therefore, there's got to be something to it, whether they can put it in words or not.
Well, and I think a lot of what we see with kids who are self-harming. Our hospitals. We have several hospitals here in the city, and right now most of them are full almost all the time, and they're looking for more beds. As a matter of fact, Maryland just closed their residential program to open up more beds for for their crisis intervention, and you know their
And tell the audience what
Okay, so-
Marillac is.
Marillac is a hospital for children and for kids. I think all the way up to 18,
Mm-hmm.
and I think it's part of the KU system,
And they struggle with behavioral,
mental health, and that kind of thing. And we've got other hospitals in Kansas City. We've got Crittenton. We've got KVC. We've got Two Rivers.
Two Rivers,
I think that we also have Center Point and Independence.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that these hospitals are full a great deal of the time with kids right now who are self-harming.
Mm-hmm.
They're suicidal. Our suicidal ideation in this city, in this country, is huge.
Mm-hmm.
With kids anywhere from 3 all the way up to 18 years old.
Correct.
At any one given time, I might have a client or two in the hospital because they can't contain themselves, because they have no self-calming skills.
That's right.
Or they don't use their self-calming skills.
That's right.
And so
We've seen a 33% hike.
and
33% hike in kids in the Kansas City metropolitan area in suicidal attempts
and self-harming.
and self-harming. So when you put the two together, it's somewhere around 33%.
Now, there's 3 things that are going on. One of them is I think we live in a very unsafe world,
Yes.
and we've got too many things that are going on as far as guns.
Mm-hmm.
I think we live in a world that is not very friendly
That's right.
in some ways. I think we also have a world where our children are spending great deals of time in front of a screen.
So I was going to say overexposure. Anyone who's seen my shows or heard my radio shows hear me go back to that every time. Overexposure. All of this is happening that you're listing. And then on top of that, we don't police their exposure because of media.
Well,
they're in front of it all the time, whether it's on their phones, the television.
It's gaming too.
Yes, that's right.
I mean, these kids are playing games like they're playing violent video games, or they're just playing games. I mean, they may be playing Minecraft.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Minecraft, when it first started out, was not a big deal. You built a building, you know.
Right,
and, you
right.
know, now you have war, you know.
Yeah.
The children are spending way too much time in front of a screen, and
much.
then they're having tantrums when you try to take them off. As a matter of fact, today I had a client in my office and the mom is one of those very conscientious people who says you can spend 1 hour. That's it. That's all you got. But every time this child goes out and is told to get off the computer, he throws a tantrum. He cannot self-calm because his mind has been so overstimulated.
Right.
Okay, so his cortisol's going, right?
That's right.
His adrenaline's
Going.
His brain is working, and he
that's right.
and then when you turn off the TV, he can't stop.
Because there is an addiction factor, which is the same effect as if you remove a person from drugs or alcohol.
And you end up with an overabundance of dopamine.
That's right.
And so with the dopamine, the rise in dopamine, the child can't stop.
That's right.
They can't calm down.
Right. That's right.
And I'm spending a lot of my time working with kids who are given phones. Phones. A 10-year-old with phones.
Way too early. Way too early.
Phones and screen time and these are kids who don't have a good sense of self-modulation to begin with.
Yes.
But they can't stop, and
That's right.
So they're ending up self-harming. They're ending up suicidal. They end up in the hospitals. It's becoming quite an issue.
It is quite an issue.
And I see a lot of it in my practice.
One of the things that people often hear me talk about now that I've got a forum to do that, but more importantly, most of my clients, I work with them on, and that is a phone check-in. We have electronics check-in. That is a place that I try to walk with them to. Of course, you can't force anything, and that's not our job as practitioners, but to rather expose them to healthier habits. But I am a stickler about that, because if you don't practice some sort of moderating with that, you're going to have a huge problem that you think is fixable by all these other things that don't really get at the issue. Yes, it takes courage. I am finding it takes courage not only to stand up to the child, but to the social climate. A lot of these parents are dealing with, they have very little support for removing a child's electronics, or how about we not expose them to those things at a very early age and convince ourselves that they need these things at 10 and 8 and 9 years old.
How about 5?
Yes.
I was actually
like their own working phones at 5.
I was in
It's amazing.
Buster, David Buster's,
Mm-hmm.
David Buster's,
David Buster's.
one day, and there was a man who was playing a war game, and he had his 5-year-old, probably maybe 5, maybe 4, standing beside him, and he was playing one character, and the kid was playing another, and they were shooting people, and there was blood coming out of these people that they were shooting, and I thought, that's really interesting. I mean, we really, we think it's okay to expose these children to that kind of violence, and no wonder we're having problems with school shootings.
Absolutely.
And it fascinates
so
me because
desensitized.
so many of the kids that I work with, I have parents who'll say to me, I'm really worried that this child that I've adopted or I want to adopt is going to be a school shooter. And I think, well, maybe you ought to think about what you're exposing the child to other than, I don't think it's I don't think it's the adoption issue.
No.
I think you really
Which
need
is
to be
what
looking
the
at
earlier
what
point
you're
covered.
Yeah,
Yes.
you need to look at what you're exposing the child to. So we just got off the topic. I apologize. It's
this is kind of what we do. We just have a unscripted, very raw conversation, and some points, are worth kind of harping on, or should I say sticking to, more than others. And so myth number 4 says that you can predict which children will be affected, which is why I chuckle when you say, we kind of got off on a tangent, because earlier I told you, a lot of times we'll talk through this and we don't even realize we've talked into the next myth, because these things all build on each other. But you just made the point about someone trying to predict and really thinking that certain things that they're seeing make it more of a likelihood that this child is going to struggle with this. Not to say that there aren't indicators, because we're talking about that. We want to talk about that, right? So that we can give some hope for, if in other words, if you know what's contributing, whether it's cause or not, then you have some hope for kind of turning it around.
Right, and I think you can also kind of overthink it.
Yes.
I have a young man who I think they're looking at the things that he's posting, and they're saying, oh, he's going to be a school shooter. And I'm looking at this kid going, I don't think so. I don't think he's going to be a school shooter. I think he is drawn to this stuff because that's what's in our environment. And it's amazing to me the number of children who I get the complaint, oh, they've accessed porn. Well, maybe they've accessed porn because it's so accessible.
It's accessible.
I mean, every single kid I got, has accessed porn. I got a 7-year-old who was on the internet the other day and came up with porn. And I thought, well, of course. I mean,
it's
out there. It's out there,
Yeah.
And they're being exposed to things that they don't understand. They don't know how to deal with,
Right.
and they confuse them. But it's part of our world now, and it's so easy to get hooked into that stuff. And this young man is 13 years old that I'm thinking about, and of course he's going to be interested. He's 13
years old.
I mean,
we don't want to look at what biologically is happening, and like you said, it's okay to want indicators, but I think a lot of times we
You
look
gotta
at
use common sense.
you gotta use common sense.
I mean,
He's 13.
you know, he's 13.
Yeah.
Right now, biologically, the most important thing to him is his penis.
Yes.
And he's going to focus on that. And
Well,
there's nothing we can do about
There's
that.
nothing we can do about
And
that.
that doesn't mean he's going to be a school shooter. It means that he's kind of focused on that
Or
part
a
of his body.
sociopath, or or
Exactly.
anything that makes him in of itself broken. Let's, for lack of a fancy word, broken. But I think more of the point here is to be more aware of our children's needs instead of our own. Being more aware of our children's needs according to developmental stages. You do not have to be an expert in developmental stages to understand them.
No, you do have to kind of think back on what you were like, though.
Yes, you do.
I mean,
Which really just requires a little bit of common sense,
yes.
right? And so it just goes on to say that although certain risk factors can be identified, there's no guaranteed way to identify which child will, all caps, have reactive attachment disorder or even a lasting trauma response, right? So it's really important, like we said, to kind of pay attention to your child in that season that they're in.
Right. Now, there are some things that you can see.
Sure.
There are some things
Talk
that you
about
can
those.
see.
Let's
And the
talk
things
about
that you can
those.
see are a child who must have control of absolutely every situation.
Mm-hmm.
And I get this complaint a lot. I got families who say, this child has to be in control of absolutely everything, and it drives me crazy because they can't let us have any control over whatever. And what I say is, one of the things that you can say to this child is,
Mm-hmm.
look, I got this.
Mm-hmm.
I got this.
Mm-hmm.
We're good.
Mm-hmm.
Let me control this one, you can take the next one.
Mm-hmm.
And the child can go, oh, okay, back off. I can let you do that.
That's good. That's good
Another
advice,
thing
good
that you
advice.
can say to a child is, I'm the mom.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to control this one.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to give you something to control. Would you be in charge of X?
Mm-hmm.
So that the child goes, oh, okay, I can do that.
Mm-hmm.
Children who feel like they have to be in control of absolutely everything feel like if they aren't, they're going to die.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if anybody has that level of intensity
Mm-hmm.
when they feel out of control.
Mm-hmm.
But when people feel out of control and they feel like they're going to die if they aren't in control,
Mm-hmm.
that's pretty serious.
Pretty serious.
So we need to instead of saying, would you just stop being in control all the time, just quit it.
Mm-hmm.
You need to back up and go, I wonder what that must feel like for that child to feel like they're going to die if they're not in control. What can I do to give that child a sense of control without handing over all the control? Would you be willing to come over and cut the carrots?
Yes.
I need some help in cutting the carrots. I need some help in watching Junior, paint.
Mm-hmm.
Would you go and draw pictures for me of on these pieces of paper so we can have tablecloths for dinner tonight?
Mm-hmm.
Give the child something to
That's right.
do so that they can feel like they're in control. Now, children who are like that
Mm-hmm.
are going to have that issue from now on. And I say this about my own son. Isaac feels like if he isn't in control, he's going to lose it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so at times
Mm-hmm.
when he feels out of control. So he has to know every single detail of what's going to happen. He doesn't have to be in control anymore. He just needs to know what happens. And I have family members and I have friends who say, well, that just drives me crazy that he has to have that. Why don't you just lean into it and say, okay, we're going to do this and this and this and this and this. And then he can go, okay.
Mm-hmm. Which is paying attention to
The
their
child.
needs instead
Right.
of our own. Because see what happens there, oftentimes, you've seen it, I've seen it, it's this power struggle. Really, you're going to lose. You are going to lose.
Well,
But
and
guess
so
what?
is
The child is going to lose. Just, yes, the child is
loses.
going to lose.
We have to step back and go,
And then the family loses,
Yeah,
right?
everybody loses.
Everybody loses.
So we have to step back and go, okay, how are we gonna deal with that? What are we gonna do when Johnny and George and Mary and Susie all need to have control because I've got 4 kids with
Right.
reactive attachment disorder.
Right.
Of course, there's some families who have 10.
Wow.
I know. And then you go, okay, now what does this person need? Was this, and if I'm paying attention,
Mm-hmm.
I can give them, each of them, a job to let them be in control of their piece of the world,
Mm-hmm.
and then things go
Much
better.
smoother. Thank you. Yeah. So, myth number 5. Bad parenting causes these children to have these issues.
Well, that's kind of a judgment issue. What do you call bad parenting?
That's right. First thing comes to mind but I just love to have these, that's what we're here to talk it through. Give people something to think about. I myself, when I'm doing prep for these shows, I'm always struck by something that I hadn't thought about. A lot of people don't think about what they stand on. They don't even think about what they say. They don't think about what they think about, because that precedes what comes out of their mouth and what comes out of their behaviors and their expressions. But that is truly a relative thing. Of course, there are certain things, like you talked about when you first described the spectrum of RAD, right? So there are certainly things, behaviors, decisions that adults can make that affect their children, that traumatize their children. But blanket statements of, oh, that's just a result of bad parenting.
So all right. So bad parenting. When there are choices that adults make
Mm-hmm.
that aren't good for kids.
Right.
Drugs, alcohol, sex,
Mm-hmm.
lots of it.
Right.
Or indiscriminate sex,
Mm-hmm.
or pornography,
Mm-hmm.
or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
There are decisions that adults make that aren't healthy for kids.
Right.
Okay, and it makes it really difficult to parent a child when an adult is making those bad choices.
Right.
Okay. Now, notwithstanding that, okay, I've had people say to me, well, Mike and Susie are bad parents because they're spoiling their child. They never let their child lay down. They never put their child down. They're always carrying their child.
Mm-hmm.
And which is interesting, because I think of drug and alcohol abuse and whatever over here, and then I think of George and Susie carrying their baby everywhere they go, and I think this is good parenting and this isn't. You cannot spoil a child by giving them too much attention.
Right.
By
Right.
meeting every single need they have. Yeah, the child's going to be kind of demanding, but they're
Right.
not going to be. That's not bad parenting.
Right.
But so we know that using drugs and alcohol and
Violence and
violence and that kind of thing, that's not good parenting, but it's also not good living.
right.
So children shouldn't be involved in that anyway.
Right.
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 But then other people make judgment calls. For example, some people might. I remember people said to me, to my wife and I, when we decided to have children, I don't think gay people should have kids.
Hmm.
And I thought, I don't think I gave you permission to give me permission.
Right.
I don't think I asked for your advice. So some people might say, well, gay people shouldn't have children. Is that do gay people make good parents?
Mm-hmm.
I think gay people make great parents.
And we're talking about the importance of being mindful, again, I keep coming back to this, of what children need versus what we think, want, desire, prefer, all of those things. And so the analogy, I thought this was really a good one. If a child had epilepsy and they had a seizure, would you blame the parents for that? It's always good to compare these things with our mind and emotions to physiological issues, because people get it more. They can see it.
Right.
Yet behaviors from traumatized children are very similar. Research indicates that trauma, especially pre-verbal trauma, kind of what we were talking about. Also, I was trying to bring our guests back to the earlier comments because this all kind of folds into each other. Things that happen when a baby is still even in the uterus. So, distorts a brain's chemistry and impedes normal functioning. Traumatized children can be more impulsive, as you've been saying, less able to self-soothe, more impacted by sensory input, and less likely to understand emotional cues of the people around them. Those children often present as oppositional to their parents and sometimes to others in authority, which then tends to have people reacting. We react, and you know what we do? We want to jump to. We have a propensity to want to jump to blame. It's where a lot of that comes in. We gotta find somebody to blame, because somehow that makes us feel like we have more control.
Right. Well, and I was telling the story about when we first took Isaac to a therapist, and she takes the child in, brings it back, and says it's your fault.
Yeah.
You're right.
Yeah.
They do that,
Yeah.
and they do decide that that it's the parents' fault, without really finding out what the history of the child is, without really finding out the history of this particular child at this particular time in history.
That's right.
and
their experience.
And their experiences, and I think we need to be slower to blame and quicker to help resolve. We need to be slower to find fault and quicker to say, I wonder if this will work instead.
Absolutely. Slow down. We're going to keep coming back to that because our kids need us to slow down. They need us to slow down. Myth number 6. Well, he or she seems normal to me. Now this one, I'll just kind of read what I got. Children with attachment disorders, specifically RAD, often do not act anywhere near the same with others as they do with their parents. Because this is what I've seen, right? Because this is where we oftentimes get a lot of misdiagnosis, therefore they don't get the help that they need. Because, yes.
This is why psychiatric hospitals don't often see the reactive attachment stuff, because you've got this shift is going off and this shift is coming on, and this is a perfect environment for a RAD kid because they never have to get close to anybody.
Absolutely. And so I think oftentimes we've kind of talked around this one a lot, that when we think so narrow about what symptoms are, and what constitute a person for having certain diagnoses, because we haven't done the original thing I said, which is real research. It really bothered me. I think I usually walk away with something, some big boulder, I call it, or chunk of something that just kind of sits in it, makes me want to just run out and figure out how to change it. This particular topic, that's what really bothered me, is the lack of real attention given to understanding it fully, understanding it more fully. And so when we don't take the time to do that, then we assume symptoms. We assume how they present, which then leads to misdiagnosis and poor treatment and ineffective treatment. So we are about halfway through. I'm going to try to take a look at any comments. So you guys will see me coming closer to the camera because I'm looking through my Facebook and seeing if there were any actual questions. And I want to thank all of you who are tuning in right now and watching live from Facebook. I really appreciate your time and your attention to this subject matter. So we had a few comments. It doesn't look like we had any questions so far. So we'll move into number 7. It says other children have had bad things happen to them, and they're fine. They're fine. Other children have had bad. Matter of fact, this is what I hear. Other children, this particular child, I know a kid who went through foster care and had this and this happen to them, and they didn't have this.
Well, okay, so you've got child A over here who had this happen, and B over here who had this happen, and this child over here had really poor attachment to begin with, didn't have the resiliency, didn't have the connection, didn't know how to self-calm, didn't know how to self-soothe, okay? And so they're going to have a hard time dealing with their level of tolerance is going to be much lower, okay? Then you got this kid over here, and this child didn't have those issues, and their level of tolerance is much higher.
Right.
So I think, and you know, sometimes it has to do with ability to be resilient.
Right.
But I think that more often, a woman by the name of Heather Forbes, and I often recommend people to read her books. She wrote a book called Beyond Consequences, and she, one of the best concepts I've really ever heard her use is this level of tolerance. Yeah, you've got Billy over here who came from a really, really poor background, really, really poor attachment, and it's kind of like a glass that's only got about an inch of left at the top, and the rest of it's got water in it. And then you got another kid over here. You got George over here. He's got this much water, and he's got a glass that's this big. And he's got all this room, this level of tolerance, you know. This, and this kid, something happens, like his favorite cereal is not available, and he's going to go overflowing. He's going to lose it. And this kid over here, with all this room,
he can handle.
He can handle that kind of, you know. So he doesn't have Cheerios. He can eat, you know, Lucky Charms.
Right.
I think that, that's why I like that analogy, that kids really, each kid has their own level of tolerance.
Right.
And what's going to tip this kid's scale isn't going to tip this kid's scale. And sometimes what tips this kid's scale may not be, he may have more tolerance one day than another.
That's right. That's right.
So we have to gauge what the scale is here, and so I think that it's really important to know the kid and know what he's gonna be able to tolerate on a given day.
That's right.
And that means what you said. I think that was a really good point. Paying attention to the child.
Yes.
Getting out of your own head, paying attention to the kid.
Yeah. Because
especially if you're fostering.
Absolutely. I was going to say, because knowing what we know about the world that we live in, knowing what we know, here's what I always challenge adults with. Think about yourself and how triggered you are, or okay, let's say you're one of those really easygoing adults. Okay, well, think about usually the 5 people closest to you. 9 times out of 10, you're going to get some good data paying attention to the things that trigger adults. So you're an adult. You have more of a capacity for tolerance, resiliency, because adults have the ability to think in a more complex way than children do. And so we can compartmentalize better than they can, and we have access to solutions more readily than they do, right? So we kind of receive negative information a lot better than kids. But we still lose it over the most minutia.
Right.
So if you think about, and I say we, meaning when you turn on the news, when you just are driving down the street, some of us in our everyday work environment, who knows, whatever it is, you get a lot of data about how much of an issue coping is with adults. So if you can imagine a child, and we put them in the same stuff oftentimes, meaning the same environments, overexposure, we talked about that. And so paying attention to the child, not lumping them all in a category, not assuming that you know, kind of gets at this as well. And kind of the last one, it's interesting, and I'll see. I really wanted to gauge your response to this one. The myth states, with enough love and support, they'll simply grow out of it.
Well, I've never met a child who simply grows out of attachment disorders. With enough, sometimes with all the love in the world, it doesn't happen. I have a young man that I've worked with for a while, and 4 years, and it doesn't matter how much love he has going on. He really struggles with the family thing, and he doesn't. He's been a part of this family since he's 15. So he's been a part of this family since he was about 8. He struggles. Now, I'm not saying that maybe someday, when he's 17, 19, 22, 25,
right,
when his brain finally fully develops, he might go, whoa, I was stupid,
right.
But it hasn't happened yet. I have kids who like mine, who all of a sudden at the age of 17, 18, 19 years old went, oh wow,
She does love me. They love me.
I'm lovable.
I'm lovable.
I mean, I think that's the important piece. I'm a lovable kid.
Yeah.
And I'm okay, and and I'm part of this family, and family's important, and okay, we're good, But I don't think it's love by itself that does it. It's knowing how to parent these kids. It's when I adopted my kids, I didn't go out of my way to adopt reactive attachment disorder kids. I didn't go to China to do it. I didn't go to Cambodia to do it. I brought home children because we didn't know about reactive attachment disorder at the time. I brought home kids, and that was what I was going to do. I was going to love my kids. What I found out is that there was a way to do it right, and there was a way to do it wrong. And the reason I went back to school and the reason I became a social worker was because nobody taught me how to do it. And I felt like somebody needed to teach other people how to do this. So I belong to an organization called Attach. And I love this organization. You can go on attach.org and look at their work, and they have therapists that they can recommend, and
attach.org.
Attach.org. And I love them. There's the Attachment and Trauma Network. I like them. There's NACAC, the North American Council on Adoptable Children. They do a lot of work with reactive attachment disorder. I access these organizations because they've got the research is so different than it was even when I first started doing this work.
I bet.
The Bessel van der Kolk and Arthur Wiedemann and all these people who come up with much better research than there was when I brought my kids home, and nobody talked about brain development when I brought my kids home. Now we're talking about brain development.
Yes.
Now we have a better understanding about epigenetics and how the brain, is affected by. Now we're looking at how the brain is affected by your grandmother. They've been doing research, and they found that people can be depressed based on your grandmother who was a Holocaust survivor, and what they dealt with is now it changes the brain so much that it actually changes the cells, epigenetics, and now we're looking at maybe mom's stress or grandma's stress and is affecting this child's attachment. What we know is much bigger than it was.
Yes, absolutely. So that's a good segue into this part where we start talking about tips, solutions, and recommendations. And I'll just throw mine out, and then I want to talk a little bit more about your book and just kind of your recommendations for next steps for anyone who may receive this and may have questions, may be stuck, whatever the case might be. So the one thing I wanted to touch on was that there is no, this is more of a, not really a what to do, but it's just something to understand. There's no one-stop medication for this.
No, there's no one-stop medication for this.
And I think that is something that happens to our kids. I don't think I know. They're definitely over-medicated.
The children that I work with are often on 3 and 4 medications.
Yes.
They're often on an antidepressant. They're often on an
Antipsychotic.
antipsychotic.
Oh, yeah. A real heavy one.
Right.
Yeah.
Most of them, very, very often they're on a blood pressure medicine, which also works as an anti-anxiety medication.
Yes.
Quifacin, Tinix, one of those.
Mm-hmm.
I think Quifacin and Tinix are the same thing. Maybe not. So yeah, the kids I work with are very, very over medicated.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Very, very over medicated. And it's interesting. I find that and I'm hearing more and more that parents are using CBD oil,
Mm-hmm.
which is hemp oil without the THC,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is sort of interesting. I tried it on my dog and it worked really well.
Okay.
I think that, I just think they're very over-medicated.
Yeah,
and there is no medication. It isn't a medication issue. This
No.
is not a mental illness like bipolar disorder.
Right.
This is a mental issue. This is not a mental illness at all. Reactive attachment disorder is a relational disorder. It's not a mental disorder.
Mm-hmm.
If it were a mental disorder, we could give you medication that would fix it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they might take medication for ADHD, but children who feel, who come from tough places
Mm-hmm.
often have ADHD because trauma looks like ADHD.
That's right. Trauma looks like ADHD.
So
Yeah. And I think that most people that know me know that I'm a huge holistic practitioner person. As far as anything that you want to consume in the body, you want to consume things that are going to affect the cortisol level, quite
Right.
frankly. You want to avoid things that are going to affect it poorly, quite frankly.
like dye.
Yes. Sugar, refined
Sugar. Sugar.
Yes.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Soda pop.
Mm-hmm.
Get away from soda pop.
Mm-hmm.
Get away from Kool-Aid, that
Mhm.
kind of stuff.
Mhm.
Drink, if you're gonna drink, sugary things, drink juice.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Let's do fruits instead of candy.
Right.
So
Try vegetables.
try vegetables.
Raw vegetables.
Raw
One of the things I used to do with my kids, and everybody laughed at me for a long time, when you talk about foods that help kids calm down,
Mhm.
5 o'clock is the witching hour for our kids.
Mm.
It really is. They're hungry. When they're
Mhm.
hungry, it triggers them to feel scared because
Mhm.
they're not going to get fed, and it just triggers
Mhm.
all sorts of things. So what I used to do, I get carrots and celery and whatever vegetables that
Mhm.
my kids would eat,
Mhm.
broccoli,
Mhm.
and I would cut it up and I put it in the middle of the table and I put some ranch dressing in the middle of it,
Mhm.
and I said, "Don't touch it till dinner," and it was always gone.
Yeah.
It was always gone.
Yeah.
And they'd say, "Oh, Mom, we were bad. We touched."
So I love that reverse psychology
Yeah.
tip that you just
And it
gave.
works
every time.
and you never have
Right?
to worry about whether they eat green beans at the end.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I mean, I can't emphasize a healthy lifestyle enough, and it's really not as complicated as a lot of parents and caregivers would make it out to be. I think it's a huge disservice to not address the intake and how it correlates to what is going on with our children.
Well, and I'm going to kind of go off on that a little bit.
Go ahead.
Okay. A lot of our kids are hoarders because they didn't get
The
fed
control,
enough,
yes,
or they didn't
yes.
get whatever
Yes.
they didn't get
That's
enough
good. I'm
of.
glad you made that
It
point.
tends to
Mhm.
it tends to translate in terms of hoarding, and very often it's stuff or food.
Mm-hmm.
Isaac was a terrible hoarder. I mean, he hoarded everything. You know, he's a hoarder. But they hoard because they didn't get enough.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what I suggest you do on that one, if you have a hoarder, is that you fill a fanny pack with healthy snacks, chunks of cheese, little baggies with chunks, little snack baggies, chunks of cheese, carrots, celery, raisins, those yogurt covered cranberry things, you know. I mean, fill it full of that stuff. Let them eat all they want for a while. Don't worry about how much. And and the parents in charge of filling it up. Okay, so at the end of the day, the parent, you know, the kid takes the fanny pack and takes it to the parent, and the parent says, "Oh, you don't have enough of this, and let's get more of that, and let's get more of this," and you fill it back up again. And that child can eat as much as they want for a bit. Stop worrying about food as far as how much they're eating, how much they're consuming. Give them what they need, and they'll stop hoarding.
That's so good. So good. That's really good. Thank you for sharing that. And then also, we would be remiss not to mention the impactful, especially in light of what you said about the hospitals growing, the inpatient hospitalization factor, and the ill effect that it is having. This, I'm saying, is individual and family psychological counseling. It's an invaluable tool. Now, you know, we might seem a little biased, but, you know, it is what it is. This is our show, and this is what we're talking about. And so we can't emphasize that enough. I find a lot of individuals either skip over that or they don't do enough research.
I don't get phone calls from the inpatient therapist not wanting to know how I'm dealing with a certain situation or where the kid is coming from. And they're not, and they get one visit, you know, every day, and you know, and that's it. But they're not involving the outpatient therapist.
Yeah.
When you interview an outpatient therapist, when you interview a therapist, find out if they see the child alone.
That's right.
Do they see, what is their philosophy? What do they think about things like spanking? What do they think about things like, you know, what is their philosophy around parenting? What's their experience working with adopted kids? You know, if that's the issue that you're taking the child for, find out what the therapist's opinion is about certain things.
Right.
Talk to the therapist on the phone for a while.
Right.
You know, I'll take the time and talk to people for half an hour, 45 minutes. You know, they can ask me anything they want about, you know, about things, but you got to find out.
Yeah, you have to find out. You have to take the time. It's called continuity of care.
And I'm not. And if a parent's not interested in doing the family therapy, I won't work with them.
Yeah,
because that's how I work.
Yes, right. I'm not going to waste your time and my time and any financial resources that you're putting into this. It's just a disservice. Education of parents and caregivers about the condition is key. It's one of the reasons we're doing this topic today, but it is key because I find that it's a huge missing chunk. There's not enough efforts put towards educating people about this particular issue.
Well, and there's good education, there's bad education.
Yeah.
So, you know, very often I will send I have a bookcase in my office, and I'll say, you can borrow any book you want. You can take any book out of my library you want. Bring it back when you're done, you know. Almost every client I've got has my book. And my book isn't meant to be a tome on attachment disorder. My book is parents who have reactive attachment disorder kids don't have time to sit down and read a 600-page book. They have time to read a 60-page book. So what my book is it's what it is what to do about it,
Mm-hmm.
how to fix it,
Mm-hmm.
or what some ideas on how to fix it.
Mm-hmm.
It talks about reactive attachment disorder. It talks about the diagnosis. It talks about things that you can do. It talks about time in, because I don't do time out.
Mm-hmm.
Because time out is not something a child can emotionally handle.
Mm-hmm.
It talks about fetal alcohol spectrum issues. It talks about sensory integration issues. It talks about auditory processing issues.
Mm.
It talks about what to do with an 18-year-old who says, I'm done with you, I'm walking out the door." It's a chapter in my book called "I'm 18 and All Grown Up."
Mm.
So it's a beginning,
Right.
and it has a bibliography, and my website has a bibliography. I have a virtual bookstore on my website.
Mm.
So that you can go to my website and you can go straight to the book and look it up on Amazon.
Okay.
Me and Amazon, we're close.
Yeah.
Uh,
I love Amazon, don't we?
and I steer people to organizations like Attach.
Okay.
Attach is a little bit different. Attach is there for both the parent and the professional,
Okay.
which is why I like it.
Mm-hmm.
And so parents can go to these conferences and get education that's geared to the parent.
Mm. Okay.
At the same time that the professional can go and get information steered to the professional.
That's good.
And they can get educated. They can begin
It's
to
usually
understand.
one or the other.
And
usually
then,
a lot of resources are for the parents in this
exactly.
area.
And there's
Yeah.
not enough conferences that are for the parent.
Yeah.
But the parent has to be just as educated. And then there's also a support group for them
Okay.
online, so they can get online and they can talk to other parents. And I gotta tell you, there is nothing like a parent with an attachment disorder kid talking to another parent with an attachment disorder
Yeah,
kid,
sure.
and not having to explain what that feels like.
Yeah.
And we also have, for the professionals, because a lot of professionals are also parents of attachment disorder children.
Mm-hmm.
We have a dual role group,
Mm-hmm.
so we can talk to other people without talking to.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
But when you can talk to other people about what's going on with your kid, and you don't have to explain why you don't know how to deal with this kid who just beat you up for the 4th time and walked out the door.
Yeah. 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 I can't emphasize enough again the need for valid and should I say usable resources for something that we have said 1,000 times over lacks research, formal research, and so it's kind of up to us, those who are closely related to this issue, to take that bull by the horn, so to speak, and move forward with it. I want to thank you. We're at the end of our time. I want to thank you for this. This has been so rich. I just know it's going to really help a lot of people. I always like to end the show by just encouraging people. You want to make sure that with this issue, you want to encourage. I think that is the last tip that I have. Encouragement is key. It's so difficult in of itself to deal with a lot of the way that the manifestations of this disorder shows up. So it's really important that we spend time, taking the time to both give encouragement to the kids. No child that manifests these behaviors is delighting in it. If you pay attention, you can see the pain that they're in.
Right.
But also for caregivers and loved ones, if you're on the outside of this, it's really important that you also do a whole lot more in terms of encouraging. If you have nothing that you can add to it, please don't subtract by being hypercritical and impatient with both the child and the caregiver.
Well, and if you're a grandparent, learn too. Learn about what's going on. If you've got if you're a grandparent of a child who has, attachment issues, learn about it.
Yeah.
Get educated about it. You said that you'd like me to say how to get a hold of me.
Yes.
My phone number is 913
Yep.
626-1018. My website is www.midamericacounseling.com.
Okay.
You can get a hold of me through my email is maftc.kc@gmail.com. It stands for Mid-America Family Treatment Center, in case you get confused.
Right.
So you can get a hold of me in any which way. If you just have a question, if somebody has a question that they want to ask about, is this what I think it is, or they need some support or whatever, keep in mind that my position is I'm not only a professional, but I'm a parent. So I know from a personal experience what it's like to have a attachment struggling kid.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm also a professional, and I've done a lot of study about this because I felt like it was my calling.
Thank you. And so I also want to emphasize to you all that are watching, especially those who are watching on Facebook, or you will see this video, please ask questions. If obviously if you're watching this or it's at the end, or we said something that you didn't understand, I can forward all the questions to Lynn if there are questions that she can answer, and make sure that you get an answer to those questions. Also, it looks like we have a couple of, let's see if we have any questions before we sign off. Someone had a question about how does hemp oil help? Well, I do recall you saying that that's just something that people are newly trying.
Right. Hemp oil actually has a calming effect on children,
Okay.
on anybody. It had a great effect on my dog.
Mm-hmm.
My dog had an anxiety disorder. Somehow or another, I managed to adopt a dog with reactive attachment disorder. And had a lot of anxiety. The hemp oil was very good at helping her to calm down and to help her anxiety to lower. And I think that's the strength of the hemp oil.
Okay,
And now you
good
can
point.
get it in Kansas and Missouri. It's legal
Yeah.
in both states.
Yeah. Okay. So for those of you who have questions for me, you can reach me at abundantlivinglegacy.org. You also can reach me by email at abundantlivinglegacy@gmail.com. And then also my phone number to my office is 913-820-2173. Also, again, if you have a question, you can either leave it in the comments if you're watching on Facebook, or you can reach out to me or to Lynn via any of the contact information that we have given you. I appreciate you tuning in and your time and your comments and your questions, your input, all of that. You have been watching the Talk About It with Twoana episode on attachment disorder and children. As always, we discuss myths and misconceptions, and we do our best to get you and your loved ones connected to the resources that you need to live a more abundant life. So I look forward to seeing you all during our next episode, and thank you for tuning in.